They were a family lost to time, buried beneath the quiet whispers of an American town that had long forgotten them. Their home sat untouched for decades, a rotting relic hidden behind overgrown weeds and the skeletal remains of gardens that once thrived. Neighbors would pass by, occasionally glancing at the peeling shutters, the sagging porch, and the rusted gate, never daring to approach. There was a stillness about the place, like the air itself feared to enter. Locals would sometimes speak in hushed tones about shadows glimpsed through cracked windows, or the faint scent of something foul carried by the wind. No one could say exactly when the family disappeared, or if they ever truly left. What the world didn't know, what the soil in the walls had silently kept, was that the house itself had witnessed horrors so intimate and grotesque, science itself hesitated to explain them. The story begins with a man named Samuel, the last known patriarch. He was a quiet figure, thin, wiry, always bent slightly as if carrying a secret too heavy for any ordinary shoulders. He and his wife, Eleanor, moved into the house in the early 1930s, seeking isolation, seeking refuge from a world that, to them, had become too loud, too chaotic, too human. Their children were few too by the accounts neighbors could remember, though records are inconsistent, scribbled across faded church registers and town hall ledgers. There were rumors, more persistent than the official records, that more children had been born, but never registered, never baptized, as if Samuel and Eleanor were creating a lineage outside the watchful eyes of the outside world. People spoke in muted horror when they mentioned the family. The children never attended school, never played in public spaces, never laughed or cried in ways that anyone could hear. It was as if they had been raised in a bubble of silence and shadow, and yet the family's disappearance was not sudden. It was the result of decades of strange behavior, odd experiments, and an obsession with preserving something they could not or would not articulate. The more you dig, the more disturbing the patterns become, patterns that suggest the family's story was never meant to reach daylight. And when investigators finally breached the house decades later, they found artifacts and remains that defied explanation, evidence that hinted at a blend of human ingenuity and unfathomable madness. The story is not just about isolation. It is about the human capacity to hide, to twist, to distort life itself in the pursuit of something incomprehensible. And tonight you will see it, through the eyes of history, through the whispers of a family the world had already begun to forget. Decades passed and the town moved on, leaving the house to rot in silence. Yet every so often someone, usually children wandering too far, or the bravest of local teens, would claim to see flickers of movement behind those boarded windows. Sometimes it was just a shadow, sometimes something more deliberate, a figure that seemed to watch, always watching, with eyes that reflected neither innocence nor malice, but something far older, far colder. Scholars who later tried to piece together the family's existence encountered a labyrinth of contradictions. Birth certificates disappeared, school records vanished, and neighbors' recollections were fragmented, like shards of a mirror that refused to form a complete image. There were letters, hundreds of them, locked away in yellowed envelopes, written in a spidery, almost childlike handwriting, yet signed with the name of Samuel or Eleanor. They spoke of strange experiments in isolation, of lessons taught in whispers, of children trained to observe rather than speak, to imitate life without truly living it. The family had constructed a world of their own, a world hidden beneath floorboards and behind false walls, where each member was both student and subject, actor and audience, caught in an endless loop of instruction and observation. Scientists who were finally permitted to investigate the property found evidence that made their professional detachment falter. The children's growth had been meticulously documented, not just in journals but in strange contraptions resembling early medical devices designed to measure responses to fear, pain, and hunger. There were jars filled with organic matter, notes on diet, hygiene, and sleep patterns, and cryptic diagrams that suggested attempts at controlling human development in ways that seemed to verge on obsession. But what disturbed investigators the most were the eyes. So many of the eyes, paintings, sketches, preserved specimens, always watching, recording, observing. It was as if the family had been trying to capture the essence of awareness itself, freezing it in time, and in doing so, had crossed a line science could not define. For decades, the house absorbed these efforts in silence until the walls themselves seemed to bear witness, whispering with a collective memory of deeds the world was never meant to know. When you step into the story now, you feel that silence, that weight. It is not just a tale of neglect or isolation. It is a chronicle of obsession, of a family willing to forsake the outside world entirely, to sacrifice the natural flow of life for an experiment whose outcome even they could not fully control. And somewhere, within the decayed remains of that home, echoes of their presence linger, waiting for someone to acknowledge them. The children, if they can even be called that in any conventional sense, grew up under rules that no outsider could imagine. They were trained to respond to commands without hesitation, to suppress instinctual emotions, and to communicate in patterns dictated by Samuel and Eleanor. Neighbors occasionally recalled seeing pale faces at broken windows, staring out with an intensity that unsettled even the bravest of adults. Those eyes weren't simply curious, they seemed to record, to analyze, to remember in a way that no child should. Some townsfolk whispered that the children rarely slept, that they moved through the house like shadows, existing more as extensions of the family's will than as independent beings. And it wasn't only physical conditioning. Samuel and Eleanor were obsessed with mental rigor, pushing the children to recite knowledge, to mimic adult behaviors, to internalize an understanding of the world that they could never experience naturally. Journals recovered later detailed experiments that tested sensory deprivation, psychological pressure, and controlled exposure to fear, hunger, and isolation. There were notations about what happened when a child cried too loudly, when a child questioned authority, when a child attempted to express personal desire or discomfort. These instances were meticulously recorded, and in some cases, punished, not with the violence one might expect, but with calculated deprivation, removing warmth, light, or companionship. The family's isolation amplified this, creating an environment where external reality had no authority, and the only truth was the one enforced within those walls. The investigators who stumbled upon this later spoke of a haunting sensation, a pervasive sense of eyes following them even when nothing was visible. It wasn't imagination. In room after room, they discovered hidden peepholes, mirrors angled to allow constant observation, and notes suggesting that Samuel and Eleanor had been recording reactions for decades, creating a database of human response so precise that it bordered on monstrous. But the most unsettling discovery was the journal's insistence that the children were not simply subjects. They were heirs meant to continue the work. Samuel and Eleanor had envisioned a lineage trained to operate under the same unyielding regimen, a family that would exist beyond conventional society, untouched, unobserved except by themselves. And somewhere in that dark, decayed house, it seemed that some trace of that vision persisted. Footsteps, whispers, shadows that moved independently of the wind, all suggesting that the family, or something that was once the family, never truly left. You can almost feel their gaze now across the years, across the distance, insisting that their story is not yet complete. By the time outsiders truly began to investigate, the house was a skeleton of its former self, yet it still carried the weight of lives meticulously controlled. Floors creaked under their steps, walls bore the stains of decades, and the air smelled of dust, decay, and something unamiable, something that suggested memory itself could rot. Among the remnants, investigators found an entire wing sealed off, untouched, as if Samuel and Eleanor had anticipated prying eyes and prepared a sanctuary for the most guarded secrets. Inside, the evidence was staggering: preserved clothing, personal items arranged with obsessive care, and a series of journals that spanned generations, or at least it seemed that way. The handwriting changed subtly over time, reflecting different ages, yet the tone remained consistent, precise, detached, and horrifyingly systematic. The experiments documented were no longer merely developmental or behavioral. They delved into the philosophical, the metaphysical. Notes suggested attempts to shape perception itself, to mold consciousness into a state unbound by ordinary human morality or emotion. In these records, the family's obsession with observation became almost religious, a doctrine that placed watching and recording above all else. They chronicled not just behavior, but thought, intention, and reaction, attempting to dissect the human soul as though it were a machine. Some investigators described a sensation that words could not capture. The house seemed alive, aware, a sentient extension of the family's will. Cameras malfunctioned inexplicably, lights flickered without reason, and the sense of being observed never ceased. There were also artifacts that defied scientific explanation: jars containing preserved eyes, sketches that seemed to shift when unobserved, and mechanical devices that suggested early attempts at automating observation. What troubled the scientists most was the realization that the family had not only studied humanity, they had attempted to replicate it, to create a controlled lineage that could think, feel, and yet remain under constant surveillance, perfected in isolation. By the end of the investigation, many left shaken, some refusing to speak about what they had witnessed. It was more than history, more than psychology. It was a confrontation with something profoundly unnatural. And as the house settles in the silence of its overgrown yard, it waits, as if the family's presence, however altered or preserved, remains, silently monitoring anyone brave enough to uncover the truth. By this point, the story begins to pierce the mind like a cold blade. The investigators, already unnerved, uncovered something that would haunt them far beyond the confines of the house: photographs. hundreds of them hidden behind loose panels and under floorboards, depicting the family over decades, yet in ways that defied normal human progression. Children appear frozen in expressions of uncanny awareness, their eyes reflecting knowledge far beyond their years. Adults appear strangely unchanged, as if time had no dominion over them. Some images showed figures staring directly into the camera, eyes wide, unblinking, yet there was a quality to those gazes that suggested they were observing more than the lens. They were looking through it, into the observer's own mind. In addition, investigators found journals detailing a ritualized form of recording, daily life charts, diagrams, and notations describing attention, thought, and fear, as though these were resources to be harvested rather than experiences to be lived. The family's meticulous documentation spanned decades, leaving a trail so precise that some theorized Samuel and Eleanor had been attempting a form of immortality, not of the body, but of consciousness. And the most unsettling detail of all, some of the children, when they reached adulthood, seemed to have vanished entirely from records. Not dead, not missing, just absent. It suggested the possibility that they had been absorbed into the family's obsession, molded to a point where individuality ceased, or perhaps that the family's experiments had succeeded in creating a new form of existence, one that science could neither categorize nor admit. The air of the house seemed to pulse with memory, with intent, almost like the building itself had absorbed the family's consciousness. And even as modern technology attempts to catalog and explain, the essence of what occurred there slips between comprehension and nightmare. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because what's hidden in this story is not simply a cautionary tale about isolation or obsession. It's a revelation that humanity, when untethered from society, can pursue truths so alien and so intimate that even history struggles to contain them. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear that this family had blurred the line between human and experiment. Artifacts suggested that the children, conditioned from birth, had been trained to observe and record, as if they were both scholars and subjects. Their education was devoid of ordinary childhood, replaced instead with tasks that tested perception, memory, and endurance. They were made to notice everything and feel almost nothing, a calculated suppression of natural human instinct. The journals and sketches left behind showed an eerie precision. Every glance, every gesture, every flicker of emotion catalogued, measured, and analyzed. Investigators later remarked on the oppressive atmosphere of the house, describing it as if the walls themselves were imbued with centuries of observation, pressing on the mind with a silent insistence that you too were now being studied. Even objects seemed deliberately positioned, not out of care, but to record, to provoke, to influence. And then there were the strange contraptions, mechanical devices designed to monitor, to measure, and to induce reactions that tested both the physical and the psychological boundaries of the children. Some devices were crude, some alarmingly sophisticated for their time, yet all shared the same purpose: to create a lineage entirely molded by the family's will, a controlled experiment in humanity itself. The investigators also discovered letters unsigned and unclaimed, suggesting correspondence with unknown parties, perhaps distant scientists or individuals complicit in observing or facilitating the family's experiments. The correspondence hinted at ambitions beyond the local town, ambitions that might have reached into the broader landscape of American society, touching on theories and practices that would today make modern science recoil. By the end, the investigators were left with a chilling realization. This was not just a family that time had forgotten. It was a family that had deliberately erased itself from conventional history, constructing a hidden archive of human life so precise, so alien, that it challenges everything we believe about the natural order. And now, as we recount their story, we are drawn into that archive, peering into a shadowed world where observation has replaced love, control has replaced childhood, and the past refuses to let go. And finally, what remains is not just a house, not just a family, but a lingering presence that refuses to be catalogued, measured, or understood. Even decades after the last known member disappeared, the home exudes a quiet horror, a memory embedded into its very structure. Scientists, historians, and thrill-seekers who dared to enter have reported inexplicable sensations, the feeling of being watched, whispers that seem to echo from walls themselves, objects moving slightly out of place, as if time itself refuses to remain linear within those rooms. Some say the family's obsession with observation succeeded in a way that no one anticipated. By meticulously recording every gesture, every thought, every expression, Samuel and Eleanor captured something essential: the awareness of life itself, and perhaps trapped it in the confines of their decaying home. And so the story lingers in that space between history and horror. It is the tale of a family whose desire to master, to document, to control life crossed the boundary into something unholy, creating a legacy that defies death and reason alike. Visitors to the house, even those who arrive expecting nothing more than dust and decay, report sudden chills, fleeting glimpses of figures in corners, and the unnerving sense that the eyes of the past are still upon them. The line between observer and observed, between experiment and subject, between life and memory has been blurred beyond recognition. And in recounting this tale, we are forced to confront a truth that is as chilling as it is unavoidable. Some families, some histories were never meant to be remembered, yet the shadows they leave behind refuse to vanish. Perhaps that is the true horror, that even when the world forgets, the past does not. It watches. It waits. And in the silence of a decaying house somewhere in America, the family that time forgot, and the science that feared, continues to exist just beyond the reach of understanding, a cautionary whisper to anyone who dares to look too closely at what lies beneath.